All right, so that was new. Yeah, maybe that's one of the updates to the software. Okay, so I'm gonna have to think of a different way to describe the class. So if somebody watches, they know that it's not just chapter 1 and chapter 2, but we actually did a bunch of them. We just read 3 through 7. And so I'll try to record that on the title somewhere so that we can keep track. So before we get started, I just want to get your general impressions of how was reading multiple chapters. Did that work out all right?
Yeah.
That's fine.
Okay, well, yeah, and Mary Lou said she got a little better idea of what was going on with the multiple chapters. And as I was reading it, because I just reread it this morning, I was thinking, well, what would happen if I only read this one chapter? And it's so short. I feel like I would have not only not had much to talk about, but by having 3 or 4 of them in a row, the story started to flow a little bit. Instead of being a little tiny piece, it sort of felt a little like it hung together as, more of a narrative. So, well, yeah. So I tried to pick a spot of ending that I didn't want it to be too long, like 20 chapters, but I also wanted it to have enough where it felt like a complete section. And I think it accomplishes that, where we basically go from, he got knocked out in the, between the drugs and the struggle, all the way to running off into the unknown. So the whole journey part of it, we just got within our chapters, and that's what we'll talk about. So when we finish up and we talk about what we want to do for next time, I have a suggestion, but we can kind of figure out what we want to do as far as how few or how many chapters we'd like to try. Okay, so something that occurred to me after class that I actually started talking about, and I saw a bright shiny object and was distracted and then wound off somewhere completely different and forgot, was I was going to explain to you what a philologist was. So I started talking about how Ransom was based primarily on Tolkien himself, that C.S. Lewis, not really making fun of his friend, although there were a few gentle pokes, I think, but basically using him as the archetype for his main character of Ellen Ransom. So they're both philologists. And if you looked up that word, which you may have, it's very much related to the contemporary field of linguistics. It's not the same. Linguistics at the university level has kind of replaced philology, but they overlap quite a bit. So philology, in its root words from the Greek, philos and logos, is basically the love of words, the love of language. So it was the study, the study of this historical development of language itself and of languages. So if we thought about linguistics, which again, it's related but not quite the same thing, where do languages come from? How do they develop? How are they related? Why is it that someone speaking in English and someone speaking in Spanish don't understand each other except for a few, a handful of words, but people speaking in Spanish and people speaking in Italian understand quite a bit? Well, they're both Romance languages. They both come from Latin more directly. Even though they're different languages, there's a pretty fair amount of overlap. So it's stuff like that. Why is it that if you've ever read any German words, even though they look like a mess with they're way too long and way too many consonants, you can almost pick out English words kind of cooked inside? Well, because there's a lot of Germanic roots in English. So a philologist is someone who studies languages not just to learn how to speak them, but also where they come from, how they develop, and how they relate to each other. All right, so that is what Tolkien did. He was a philologist. And his fictional works that he's so famous for, The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, which his son compiled after his death, these stories come out first of his amazingly bizarre ability and frankly need to create fictional languages. He created the Elvish languages before he wrote the stories. So if you have ever seen a fantasy movie or a science fiction movie where people speak a made-up language, he sort of pioneers that. I'm not sure that there were fictional works before this that so fully developed a literal working language. Like the languages that he develops, that Tolkien develops when he writes Lord of the Rings, like they all work. He created them, but they work. They work like a natural language would work. And if you've ever wondered where, like in a science fiction or fantasy movie, and they just kind of give gibberish names, well, for the most part, they do. It's just gibberish. They make it sound old-timey, or they make it sound futuristic-y. But Tolkien actually developed like this whole, what if these people really lived, and how would their grammar work, and how would you conjugate their verbs, and all this really amazingly detailed and creative stuff that it adds this level of richness and depth that extremely few other works ever touch, because it's like a three-dimensional object. If somebody writing a fantasy work about elves and dragons, and they called their dragon, Gromthar, the unrealistic, and the dwarven warrior of Jokbard, the blackness, they just sort of made up stuff that sounded kind of vaguely fantasy-like. But then Tolkien did something that you might assume was similar, but everything just worked. And even if you didn't realize that it all fit together, somehow your brain recognized that everything, instead of a two-dimensional prop, these were like three-dimensional objects.
Well, a lifetime.
It was a work of a lifetime, really.
Yeah.
But he also loved it. He was so weird. It was like leisure time for him, was inventing languages. It takes all sorts, but that's not how I like to spend my downtime. Anyway, one of the better descriptions I've gotten of this was, if you have ever seen a play and seen the stage setting and it looks very realistic, but then if you get on stage and you walk behind the set, it's just all flat cardboard or plywood, and it's only painted on one side, but they make it look realistic from the view only of the audience. Well, imagine if for a play, they not only created three-dimensional sets, they built a real city for the play to occur, but just for that, like that's what Tolkien would do. And the funny thing is, it all comes from his love and knowledge of languages, which is the philology, which Ransom and Tolkien would share. And so I give that, not because it's going to be pertinent just yet within our chapters, but he's gotten the barest hint of why Devine and Weston might think he's useful. Any chance that now that we've talked about philology, you can see why why Weston and Devine might think that he's useful?
Mm-hmm.
Why?
Well, if they're going someplace where there are people, and the people talk to each other, undoubtedly,
yes,
he might be able to be helpful with that.
All right. So since he discovers, at least by implication, that there are creatures of some sort and creatures who communicate, well, then maybe the guy who is an expert in languages and language development might be useful in the communication with this extraterrestrial species. All right. Anyway, let's go on back. We don't necessarily have to take it chapter by chapter, but I will try to make sure that we cover the broad strokes. So we stopped at chapter 2, again, with Ransom being knocked unconscious. He had one last ditch attempt to escape, and he misses it. By an inch, he misses it and blacks out. Where does he wake up?
Inside the spaceship.
Right. And it takes him a little while to figure out that he is not in a room. So what's some of the ways that he figures out he's not just in, because initially it's like he thinks he's in the basement or one of the other buildings on the property. Yeah, but he kind of figures out that's not it. So what starts tipping him off he's in a strange place?
The walls and floors aren't right.
Yeah, the walls and floors aren't right. And that was a really interesting way. We had a little time to kind of see it through his eyes. And when they actually make it to Malacandra, he says something explicitly, which I think is also connected to this moment, about it's really hard to see something when you don't understand it.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like he doesn't quite get the Malacandran layout because, I mean, his eyes are taking in information because his brain can't process it. It's really hard to see anything and make sense of it. So even this room that he wakes up in, he can tell it's not right. It's weird, but it takes him a while to figure out what about it is weird. It's just like his brain just says something's off. There is and this is just kind of this is a psychological or physiological, a neurological phenomenon. But think about this, and this will kind of come into play a little bit. But they have done psychological studies of memory where they take a chessboard and they take somebody who does not play chess and they set the pieces out and they ask you to, take, a minute to memorize the pieces, and then we're going to remove it and give you a piece of paper, and can you fill in where the pieces are supposed to go? And people get, they get it right at this very low percentage. Like, let's say they can get, 10% of it right. Okay. Now, then they repeat the same experiment with a chess master. And the chess master, by looking at it and concentrating for a minute, has this hugely better way of memorizing. And now instead of only being able to reproduce 10%, they might be able to reproduce 90% or even 100%. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yep.
Why would you think that's the case?
Because they're dealing with the chessboard all the time, memorizing the moves.
Right? Now, then the final step of the experiment was asking both parties to do the test again, but this time, instead of having the chess pieces arranged in a fashion that the chess master understood, they put them randomly on the board. And when the chess pieces are randomly on the board, the chess master and the non-chess player both remember at roughly the same low rate. It makes no difference to the person who doesn't know chess. They always remember about what is like 10% or something, because to them it's always random. The chess master can take an intelligible board, a board that looks like it's in the middle of a game, and they recognize the patterns. And so they can remember it to this very high degree. But when you just put random pieces or pieces that are on a way that makes no sense in a chess game, suddenly the advantage of understanding chess goes out the window. And then it's just about strict memorization. And the chess masters do about as well as everybody else. So I just want you to keep that in mind, not just for this chapter, but in the chapters to come, that the more you understand something, the better you see it. The more clearly you see it. And so it kind of starts off, he's in this, you know, a room that is unintelligible to him. And why does it turn out to be so weird? What does he eventually find out?
It's the shape of the ship.
The shape of the ship itself. And what's the shape?
A globe.
Yeah, it's roughly spherical, and it's some, you know, it's basically round. And now
Center is hollow.
the center of it is hollow, so he's not in the center. And it's basically described as operating kind of like a miniature version of the Earth, where you're walking around the center and everything beneath your feet feels down. As long as drawing towards the center, that feels down, no matter what your other orientation is. In essence, that's like the Earth. What's up and down to us is not up and down to an Australian as far as an orientation to, say, the sun. It just so happens that they're on the opposite end of this giant globe, and it all feels flat to us. But if it was much, much smaller, we might be able to perceive it in that case. So he's looking at like rounded walls and a rounded ceiling and things that change as he moves from room to room or hallway to hallway. And we kind of discover that with him. And initially, even the descriptions don't make a ton of sense, right?
The floors change to be the walls and
yeah,
so forth.
But after he understands more of where he is, he's able to describe it a little better. And after we understand what's going on, I think we understand it better. And we can maybe even sort of visualize what it must be like walking from room to room or hallway to hallway in this roughly spherical ship where he is walking around an empty middle. And you, what else did you mentioned something that was very different, not just the weird walls, but it was so bright.
Yeah. And you could feel heat on one side and cold on the other.
Right, which is why he started thinking of a furnace initially, like, no, that's not right, that's not right. And there's something about the light that he can't quite understand or express, but it's different. It's just different. So he is able to see there's some kind of portholes in this, and he is able to see outside. What does he see?
Thinks it's the moon, and it's getting bigger and bigger and brighter, but it's
right.
not, it's the Earth.
Right. So he is able to see what looks like the moon, but impossibly large. Like the moon should never be that big. The stars should never seem so bright, but they seem intensely bright, but with an intensity that's different than just, it's kind of a difficult to describe thing. It's not just that they shine a little brighter. Their intensity just seems almost more vivid, almost like they're more real. And it begins to figure out that it can't just be an exceptionally clear night, but that he is actually not just looking up at the sky, but he's in it. And who confirms this to him?
Weston.
Weston does. So just out of just raw speculation, why do you think he gets most of the information early on from Weston rather than Divine? As a matter of fact, in that first chapter, I don't think he sees Divine at all. It's all Weston, the guy he doesn't really know. Just any thoughts?
Well, for one thing, he's the only one there as far as as Ransom knows at that point. And I think the whole idea of concocting this is really Weston's idea, and Devine is just kind of a Yahoo man and follows along, and he invests, but so that he gets a return on his investment. So the brains behind the whole thing is Weston.
Yeah.
At some point, it says we are obeying orders.
Right. Right. We'll get to that. So remember that Weston has been described early on as a physicist and as an eminent world-class physicist. Weston basically says there's only 5 or 6 people in the world who could understand my explanation if I tried to give it to you. And I wouldn't if I thought you could understand it. Why wouldn't he? There's basically a double reason. Like, I'm not going to give you an explanation of how this works and where we're going, because number one, you wouldn't understand it. But if you did understand it, I wouldn't tell you. Any thoughts about why? It's never stated.
They wanted his feedback. They didn't want him to know.
I'm sorry, say that again, Marion.
They wanted his feedback. They didn't want him to know ahead of time.
Okay.
And there was some mention about risk.
Because he thought he would escape.
Okay.
Oh,
Probably he wouldn't have gone if he knew. He
For
might
sure.
cause problems.
But even in describing how the ship was traveling, how this all worked, and where they were going, like which planet, he was going to tell them that. That it was all. I'm not going to tell you because you couldn't understand, because you have to be eminent in the field to understand it or not. But if you were eminent in the field, I would not explain it to you. I think it's out of like a fearful jealousy. He has invented something and he does not want anyone to know just yet until he's done with it what he wants to do. So if Ransom could have actually understood the explanation, I think Weston would have been afraid he would steal it. Mm. So number one, if you were smart enough to know, I would keep this a secret from you because it's mine. But you're not smart enough to know. You're too stupid to understand the explanation, so you're not even worth the time to try. And I think there's a little bit more of revealing his character. This is who Weston is. We got a little bit of that in the very beginning, and I think we're seeing more of it now. Weston and Devine both might be bad guys, but they seem bad for different reasons.
Yes.
Devine seems like sort of a smarmy, hollow money grubber. He's essential to this operation, but he kind of doesn't care about the scientific achievement. He's always got an eye for there's some sort of profit to be made. Weston, we get another conversation between Weston and Ransom that really reveals a lot about the character of Weston. This is where they talk about the scientific progress that will happen and how Ransom ought to be, he ought to be glad to be a part of this.
There's a,
like his rights were being, abridged.
He says, my only defense is that small claims must give way to great.
Yes, exactly right. And they kind of work through that a little bit about what that means and why Ransom hates that thought. What does that tell you about the character of Weston? That's that quote.
The goal
I think that's a part of how Weston is a bad guy.
To him, the goal is more important than the means. You get there by any means possible.
Yes.
If you've determined this goal is worth it.
That's right. So when the ends justify the means, suddenly almost anything is not only possible, it's not only permissible, you might even decide it's necessary. So if he has this goal of like this scientific achievement in and of itself is so important, he says basically like, even if it costs the rights of millions, it still must be done. So that's the kind of bad guy he is. He's not self-centered, looking for a financial profit like Devon. But he's the kind of guy who I think would do anything to anyone if he thought the reason was significant enough. There's a coldness and a calculating nature to this. That already, if you think about what they've done, everything that has happened to Ransom, they were going to do to that poor kid who would have understood a lot less. And remember that Weston was really kind of defending that early on in the last section that we read by saying he was kind of subhuman. So it didn't really count. So, you know, more and more gets revealed about these guys, about what they say and what they do. And I just think that's worth kind of pointing out here and there. All right, so what else?
What Ransom keeps wanting to know why me?
Right. So what is the answer? Why are they bringing the third person?
Well, I'm not sure. Is that the place where they said they were obeying orders?
Yes. Obeying orders. Do you get the impression that Weston is a guy who obeys many orders?
No.
Not really.
No.
Not really. So I will say within our chapters, we're not going to get an answer to that. But that's definitely worth remembering.
So they've been there before. Talk to whoever.
Now, how do we figure out they've been there before? How does Ransom figure out this is not the first trip? Because this has to get revealed to him, because for all he knows, the experiment is the first time occurring. But Weston says something that very clearly reveals it's not his first time. Remember what he says? He names the planet. He names the planet. The planet he calls Malacandra.
Say that again?
Malacandra.
Okay.
And Ransom says something like there isn't any such.
Well, right. Ransom says, I don't know what's a Malacandra, and what's Divine's. I mean, what's Weston's answer?
A star. Ransom thinks it's a star.
Yeah, Ransom thinks it might be some kind of star, and Weston, you know, kind of chides him for being a dummy. That, you know, of course we're not going as far as that. So it's a planet. It's very distinctly implied it's within our solar system, because we're not traveling to a distant star. So within our solar system, there is no Malacandra. And what's Weston's response to that?
He says that's the real name because that's what the people who live there call it.
Right. Right. So that's where it's very clear now that they've been there at least once, if not even multiple times in the past, because they know that it's inhabited, and they've interacted enough with the inhabitants to actually have a name now. So he declines to tell Ransom the Earth word for the planet called Malacandra. And I don't know about you, but I don't remember there being a reason other than it's just sort of beneath him. Oh, well, there is, what's one reason that Weston gives about not giving him more information? A practical reason.
You can't understand, either don't know or you wouldn't understand. And then again,
well, Weston has a ready-made excuse to why he doesn't answer questions and why Ransom ought to shut up. Remember what he says? They only have so much oxygen on board. So once again, the practical scientific numbers man, when he feels like it, says, we have this extremely limited supply of oxygen, no unnecessary movements, and that includes talking, so shut up. Which I don't think is, I mean, I'm sure there's some level of truth to that, but I got the impression that's just a ready-made excuse.
Yeah.
Because Divine seems to talk whenever he feels like it. And it's only when Weston gets annoyed that they shut up and they stop talking. But I don't think it's quite so precise that they can't say a few extra words. But for whatever reason, he cuts off the conversation there. And it's one of those, oh, well, we can't, you know, we can't afford the spare oxygen for me to give you an explanation. But I think there's also, if we are starting to understand who Weston is as a person, I think there's just a level of this is beneath me to talk to. The fact that he so easily mentions a worm, if a worm could be made to understand the sacrifice being asked, the worm would do it gladly. I think even as a highly trained academic and obviously intelligent person like Ransom, that Weston would still be pretty comfortable comparing him to a worm. So, all right, we do finally get to see a little bit of Divine. So what's the interactions with Divine like?
Some reference to the old school time.
Yeah, I know you'll do well by it. So again, sort of vaguely alluding to a purpose. That Ransom is somehow going to suit a purpose, and that Divine is sure he's up to the task. If you remember our discussion from last week, Tom was perturbed that when Ransom came across the scene of Weston and Divine kind of violently assaulting the boy, that he was way too calm. And that when they were giving the explanation of how they were going to calm the boy down and would you like to stay for a drink, that Ransom was way too naively trusting. Right, Tom?
He's contemplating.
You remember that though, right?
No, honestly, I don't.
Okay. Anyway, I remember you saying that seemed kind of unrealistic that he'd be so blasé about it. And I was saying, well, you know, in incredible circumstances, we tend to rationalize that before you can accept something being outlandish, you want to give it a reasonable explanation. The reason I bring that up is Ransom seems relatively calm throughout all of this. He has been kidnapped and is now being transported to a different planet. Why not freak out? Why not assault Weston? Why become the cook? Why cooperate at all?
Would have
I
no
mean,
way.
at this point, while he's on this spaceship, well, he has no alternative.
Right, and I think that's where we are. So if there was ever a question of, you know, is this Stockholm syndrome or is he just confused? I mean, I think it's just more of a matter of what else can you do? You know, we sort of had that early on where when he's alone by himself and he starts figuring out that he's in space, that he's first contemplating like this very savage physical defense of himself. He's going to go out swinging. But then after he wakes up, he's like, well, I've settled down. let's think through this. So I think there's a real element of what good would it do for him to try to attack Weston as they're hurtling through space. It's not like Ransom can turn the ship around. He hasn't the slightest idea of what's going on. As a matter of fact, what does Weston know about how the ship is controlled?
Repeat that, please.
What does Ransom know about how the ship is being controlled?
They won't let him get him into the control room.
Yeah, he knows absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
There is a control room that he can sort of realize that's what it must be, but he's not even allowed into it. So he is 100% at their mercy.
Absolutely.
So he's just made a calculated decision. I might as well be cooperative because there's nothing I can do, at least at this point.
I was surprised they allowed him to explore. It said that he explored room to room.
Right. He explored room. So it's okay for him to explore. Obviously, it's off limits to go into the control room. Why do you think they're letting him explore otherwise?
Maybe there's nothing there to do anything.
Yeah, I'm sure they don't care. There doesn't seem to be anything that he can mess up or do anything about. And how long are they on board?
He thought at one point about 2 weeks.
Yeah, it's a while. So I mean, imagine
28 days. Yeah.
Imagine being in a series of relatively small, relatively empty rooms for weeks. And there's just not much to do. And some of it is just a level of boredom, maybe, and kind of like Ransom makes the internal calculus, it's not worth fighting them. Maybe they make the internal calculus, it's not worth trying to keep him confined to a room. Let him wander around and stay out of our hair. You know, he can't really do any harm. I don't get the impression there's anything that they are nervous about other than keeping him out of that control room.
And Weston did tell him that it would be 28 days.
28, thank you. Thank you. So, it's a while. So, so getting back to Ransom kind of discovering his new life for these next few weeks, what are some of the things that he winds up doing?
Cooking.
Cleaning up.
He cooks, he cleans. Why?
The other two don't do it.
Well, they don't do a very good job at the very least. But there's a really interesting internal reason Ransom chooses to do this. You recall?
The other men did not give any effort to preparing food. They just sort of slopped something together or laid it out.
Right.
And so the food was just more pleasing.
Sure.
But he's doing it on his own accord as well. So he's not forced into slavery.
I think that's maybe the most critical component of this. He makes the choice.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be done. He prefers the sense of I'm choosing to cook and clean rather than being forced to do it. The mechanics may be the same, but it makes a difference to Ransom. Why?
He feels a sense of autonomy, of some sort of control of his life, which he had very little.
Yeah, and I think when he has almost none of that, finding it where you can, I think can be extremely important. If you ever come across stories of like POWs, and they'll say either how they survived or how they kept sane and continued confinement or regular torture or just some really awful circumstances, it's sometimes the smallest of things, the smallest of ways that they made a connection with their fellow prisoners and even those little bits of communication kept them sane. Even little bits of mental games that they would play, or little ways that they would isolate this one part of me you can't have or you can't touch. And that was maybe the difference between the guys who were broken and died and the guys who were able to survive. And so already Ransom has basically made he's carved out a place of autonomy and integrity. He's able to hold on to some humanity. There's something that's very practical, but I think a little dehumanizing about this process that we haven't brought up yet. What else did he have to do in order to be in the spaceship for weeks at a time? This happens very early on. He's naked. The heat is oppressive. It's not a humid heat, but he's basically naked. And then this is kind of an offhanded thing, but he's wearing this kind of metal belt with weights on it to try to compensate the weird gravity. So if you ponder that for a moment, how comfortable would any one of us be in a confined environment with basically two strangers being naked?
Not good.
Yeah, not at all. But obviously, after the first little bit, they don't even bring it up anymore, because that's all there is. You don't have an option, and you just get used to it. After months and months of wearing face masks that we never wore before, you just kind of get used to it, right? It just sort of, and it's not like I like doing this or I don't like doing it. It's more like it just is what it is. It's a uniform. Thank you. I think that's a great way of putting it.
Because when we started taking them off, I felt like I needed to put it back on. You know, it felt like it was a part of me.
Right.
Places where you need to.
Yeah.
You know, Sam, did you get your head shaved in boot camp?
I did.
Why do they do that?
Well, so everybody is the same, but also, I guess, for sanitary reasons, you know, when you're out in the field.
Yeah. There's a practical element of it's just easier, but there's also it's intended to be a little dehumanizing, not in a malicious way, but in a, you know, tamping down the individuality so that you can be a part of a wider unit. Some of the uniqueness of you gets put on the shelf. And, you know, we could say in something like boot camp that that's done for a positive purpose. But, you know, if somebody's in prison, it's not uncommon to, you know, have stuff stripped away from them. Even if it's going to be re-added later, but it's all part of this maybe process. And so there's been some dehumanizing in his kidnapping, in his drugging, in his, you know, he's had to remove his clothing. And it's stuff that he's gotten used to, but he's confined like a child. You can go here, but you can't go there. You can ask questions. I might give you an answer and I might not. You're going to be told repeatedly, you can't understand this anyway. There's a lot of breaking down of his humanity. And so he kind of carves a little space where he says, it might just be cooking and cleaning. And they might have at some point forced me to do it at gunpoint. But while I can say this is mine and this is me, I'm going to hold on to it. And I just thought that was a really kind of noteworthy moment. Even if it felt kind of small, I think it's not insignificant. All right. Other than some of the mechanics that happen in the narrative, which we can still sort of parse out, there is an element of him exploring and understanding his environment that I think is essential to understanding the wider story. And it's only going to get more important later on. I want to talk about the concept of outer space as Ransom experiences it for the first time. Experiences something different than what he's read in a book and what he's imagined back on Earth. Now that he's in it, what is it really like?
It's not dark and black.
It's not dark and black.
As we had thought it might be. No clouds, moon, sunrise, planets, constellations. And yet he feels different, but he feels a new, we call it vitality.
Okay, he feels a sense of vitality. Why do you, he feels like somehow slightly more awake, somehow more energetic, somehow more purposeful. He says he even has like, he even feels more magnanimous, like these virtuous feelings. Why? What do you think's going on? Well, and it doesn't, he doesn't completely understand it either, right? Because he assumes he should be scared, but he feels somehow different. So, any thoughts about why?
Doesn't Weston say something about now that they're not within the Earth's atmosphere, he's getting hit with different, I don't know, ions or something that.
Right, yeah, Weston has an immediate and a very simple and direct scientific explanation. There are cosmic rays that are affecting you that normally don't make it to the atmosphere of Earth. Is Weston telling the truth?
Probably not.
Well, you say probably not.
I mean, that's just my opinion of Weston.
I'm gonna suggest that he is telling the truth because I'm not sure we've seen Weston lie. Weston seems to be like an evil man, but I'm not sure he's a liar. Divine, I think, would lie up and down. That's my impression. The evil of Divine is very low, sneaky, selfish, steal from your grandmother when she's not looking kind of evil. Weston's evil seems to be very self-important.
Well, when he asked me questions, he said, either you won't understand it or it's something I can't tell. He never fudged on.
Right, I think that's worth remembering. I don't think Weston has ever told him a lie. Like when there's been like, oh, we're gonna get you a drink or whatever, and it turns to be drugs, I think that was always Divine. I think Weston has always told the truth. He might say, I'm not going to tell you anything because I don't understand it, or I don't feel like telling you anything. But I think Weston has always told the truth in the sense of, I think Weston assumes he is a quote unquote great man. And in that greatness, lies are maybe beneath him. But it's funny, like morality also seems to be beneath him. But almost like it wouldn't occur to Weston to lie, almost like it's too much trouble. You're not worth the effort of coming up with a story. I think Weston would just tell him the truth if he told him anything at all. However, if you remember, I said that the key to understanding the story can be seen in a quotation from one of the Narnia stories about a star. Remember I told you a quotation about Ramandu, the retired star, and the little boy from our world is like, wow, that's so amazing that in Narnia stars are like people, because in my world, a star is a ball of flaming gas. And that Ramandu's answer was, even in your world, that's just what a star is made of. That's not what a star is. So let me remind you of that to say, I think Weston is telling him the truth, but I don't know that that's all that is true. I think there's more to it. And Weston may not understand. And why I think that's the case, how does Ransom start describing space? He says the empty vacuum of space, visions that he had from Earth and reading textbooks and stuff, cannot capture the true experience. He's got a better term for what it feels like to be out there. And it's not an empty, cold vacuum. What does he say? Well, when someone who lived 1,000 years ago would look up at the sky, they might see the stars stretching across and say, they wouldn't call it outer space, they would call it what? The heavens.
Heavens.
So Ransom can't quite understand it or put his finger on it. But what the textbooks called an empty, cold vacuum, he feels like is almost impossibly full. And he starts pondering these philosophical things about light and planets and fullness and emptiness. And it might even start feeling a little confusing, but everything comes from a sense, not of emptiness, but of fullness. The stars seem brighter and almost stronger now that he is in space. He feels brighter and stronger. And even some of the qualities he wishes he had on Earth, he starts feeling these feelings, and maybe cosmic rays are a part of it, but maybe that's what it's made of, but it's not what it is. Maybe being in the fullness of the heavens affects him in a way that perhaps mechanically it's happening through cosmic rays. But that's not all that it is. Maybe being in the fullness of the heavens, exposed for the first time, maybe it's actually doing something on a very deep and profound level.
And that's where Weston told him to stop talking. He was using that.
Well, yeah, now you're using up oxygen because, you know, there is nothing for Weston other than numbers and chemicals and equations. But I'm thinking Ransom is even now starting to feel some kind of spiritual connection. Why would you think that Ransom might be feeling a spiritual connection to any of this? There are a couple of hints. Do you think Ransom has a spiritual life of his own prior to this moment?
Yeah.
Okay, how do you know?
Because he seemed to be like a caring person.
Seemed to be like a caring person,
Boy.
concerned about the boy, right?
And he was trying to see the good in divine.
Yep, trying to see the good and divine. It's a subtle comment, and it is not deeply delved into. But Ransom is a Christian. He describes himself very briefly and very quickly as being pious. And this comes up when he ponders suicide.
Yeah.
That he would desire forgiveness, and he has to kind of think through the implications of, if I'm going to be sacrificed to this alien creature, these two awful people have kidnapped me and are now going to feed me or sacrifice me or something to this thing, maybe I go out on my own terms instead of that. But he refers very almost obliquely to piety and a desire for forgiveness, and then kind of rationalizing, well, if I was, you know, to either commit suicide or to die in this process, it's not the suicide of despair. That it wouldn't be sinful, basically. He has no other option. He has no other choice. This would actually be an act of autonomy. If he was about to, like, you know, fed to lions or whatever. So this, I mean, he's not going to sit down and talk about church attendance, but we get this little offhanded comment that I think if you recall it and will allow it to sit in your brain, just might influence how you see some of the things that Ransom says and does. What would you assume about the spiritual life of Weston and Divine? They don't have any. Yeah, Weston, I think, is way too scientific to entertain anything supernatural at all. And Divine, I think, can't see past his own wants and needs. This occurring back in the 50s would mean that there was probably some presumed church attendance at some point, like as a child or chapel at school or something like that. But we've already seen that Divine was the guy who, in school, mocked everything and everyone in authority. That's how he first got sort of popular.
And there was some comment at the way back that Ransom couldn't imagine how this man, knowing what he knew about him, ended up gaining wealth.
Right.
It just, his judgment of.
And so I want to maybe suggest something about, and connect it to that star is more than a ball of flaming gas. Weston could be absolutely right. Again, it's cosmic rays. I'm not sure Weston is personally capable of knowing or understanding anything other than that, but Ransom might be. Remember the chess master who can see a board that makes sense and observe patterns that others can't? Well, maybe Ransom is the one who, in a funny turn of events, understands something about what they're experiencing that Weston can't, even if Ransom tried to explain it.
He talks about that visible light is also a hole or a gap, a mere diminution of something else.
Yeah.
Something that is to bright, unchanging heaven, as heaven is to the dark, heavy earths.
Yeah. Starts getting a little philosophical there.
Yeah, it's like he thinks there is a heaven. There's something beyond.
That's right.
The world he's living in.
The barest hint of kind of a Platonic ideal that what we see and perceive in our mortal lives and on earth is somehow an imperfect reflection of an eternal form or an eternal truth. And I'll say that thought may come up again. So hurtling through the heavens and almost being overwhelmed by the experience. But positively, this has not been a negative thing for him, even though, it's obviously a bad situation, but being bathed in the presence of the heavens seems to bring out good things in him, not bad things. But now the journey starts to change. As they get closer and closer to Malacandra and the gravitational pull of the planet takes over from the center of the spacecraft, how does the journey change?
Temperature changes, have to put the clothes back.
Right, it's starting to get colder.
And warmer clothes.
And the gravity.
The gravity's messing them up about the rooms and the orientation, and they have to start moving things into one location because eventually all gravity will point in that one direction. You can't have stuff, in every direction. And then the misery of their mass changing its experience of weight. So if you remember from, high school physics, mass and weight are different things. We use them interchangeably because it's just convenient. But if you've ever gone to the Science Center and seen a scale that says this is how much you would weigh on the moon, and it's way less, your mass, the matter of your body does not change, but weight being more of a function of the gravitational pull, heaviness is not the same thing as your amount of matter, because your amount of matter doesn't change whether you're on Earth, on the moon, in outer space, or on mitochondria. But your weight, how you perceive it, how you feel it, heavy or light, well, that can change based off of gravity. And gravity can change based off of the particular gravitational pull of whatever body is attracting. So they start feeling like their weight is doubling every day. And I have a hard time, kind of picturing that or understanding it, other than trying to imagine how miserable that must feel. Mm-hmm. And so it's just kind
Especially
of a
after
horrible
being weightless.
Experience. What?
Especially after being weightless.
Well, yeah, and weeks worth of kind of getting used to it.
Yeah, yeah.
And so through the kind of misery of this, everyone, whatever's been sort of amicable, kind of goes back out the window. Because now they've got work to do, and it's uncomfortable, and they're not really friendly anymore because it takes too much effort and energy. They barely eat, and when they eat, they don't bother to cook. They're just kind of shoving stuff in their mouths.
They're having some physical reactions too.
But that's
headaches and rapid heart.
But that's roughly the time where Ransom overhears some stuff. What does he overhear between Weston and Divine?
Conversation where they were talking about making preparations the next day, talking about leaving the ship, carrying a drug man.
Right. So he's already overhearing some things that have implications to him. Basically, whether or not they should drug him. And what are the pros and cons that Ransom overhears?
Well, if they drug him, then he wouldn't do anything.
Yeah.
And they're saying he could be walking and working.
That's right. He'd be dead weight, and that would be more trouble. And how is all of this striking Ransom? He's definitely getting worried. And there's now finally a hint of what Weston meant when he said obeying orders. Not much of a hint, because he not only doesn't understand what they're saying, but he's getting bits and pieces. But he does recognize something they say. What do they say?
Be a sacrifice?
Maybe. Something has asked for him. And there's something about a Sorn. What in the world is a Sorn? Thoughts?
There's an implication it might be a human sacrifice.
Right?
Sorn, inhabitant of the planet.
Okay, so it must be an inhabitant, like he's piecing together, they've been here before, they've been here enough that they've met inhabitants, and those inhabitants have communicated to them. Sorns must be the inhabitants, and for some reason a Sorn wants me, or has told them they need to bring someone to them. So now that the journey part is almost done, and what's going to happen to him when they finally land soon has become a little more clear, what does Ransom decide to do? Right. He's going to escape. Or if he can't escape, what is he prepared to do?
He's going to arm himself.
He finds the sharpest knife he can, and he's never going to let it go. He's going to have it on him all the time, because when push comes to shove, what is he prepared to do? he is going to fight to the end.
Yeah.
He is going to go down swinging. He will kill as he is killed.
Yeah.
Because clearly those are the stakes. Whatever this Sorn is, it sounds like they need to sacrifice him to the Sorn, whether he's going to be killed or eaten or whatever. So if that's my fate, I'm not going to take it laying down.
I have a question.
Yeah.
It probably doesn't really relate, but I don't know. He was talking about H.G. Wells, and the word Bogies was mentioned. Is that where the boogeyman comes from?
Where are you?
Okay.
Every now and again, there's a word that I have to look up too, because he'll make an offhanded reference or he'll use a vocabulary word. Like, I don't get that. But that's fine. I mean, if you ever have to look something
If I
up,
can
look it up.
find it out, right now I don't.
Okay. So they do land. They have we get this new experience again of trying to make sense, like his brain can't make sense yet of what he sees, which doesn't that kind of make a strange amount of sense? An alien world, for a world to be truly alien would mean it is just different, not maybe a little tweak here and there, but just different in a way that our brains aren't quite prepared to process. We get like the chess master looking at random pieces. There's no pattern in that. Can't make sense of it yet. What are some of the things he does see and tries to make sense of?
Pale, like watercolors.
Okay, a pale watercolor world. It just looks different. It's a lake, but it's what's interesting about the liquid?
It's like soft.
It's blue. It's not blue like water looks blue in the ocean, but apparently it's actually blue. And the waves have a weird motion that doesn't seem right somehow, doesn't seem natural. And what about you see something that's kind of like a tree, but what's different? It seems sort of soft and rubbery, and the trunks seem more like tubules, and it's way too tall and slender, and the branches spread out way too far to look like it would actually support itself. And he says the only thing that kind of makes sense is thinking about underwater vegetation. And if you ever seen like big plants underwater that sort of, but if you were to take them and put them on the land, they need the support of the water. And yet somehow here, they seem to be supported. So it's that trying to make sense of something that he has no pattern for yet. I'm almost imagining like giant celery stalks or kelp beds or something that they're so out of place, they seem difficult to comprehend. But Weston and Devine have actually built a little camp there. So how many times have they been here, do you think? Yeah, it's got to be more than once. I think it's maybe even a bunch. They've been here enough to build a camp, to stock it with supplies, to lock it up, and to have gained some sort of information from the inhabitants in order to call it Malconda. So my guess is they've come multiple times. So how do we end? What's our cliffhanger? Why does he run?
Creature
All right, now they're creatures. Weston and Divine have already been like kind of agitated and on edge, and now he sees creatures. He can't really describe them. They seem too big. They seem too willowy. They seem too rubbery. They seem too ethereal. There's just something obviously alien, and they are coming where? Right towards him, and that's enough is enough. So that's his key, and so he runs off. Remember that Weston and Divine are armed. There's some kind of aggressive or ominous creature that seems to appear from the water, and now all alone and on a completely alien planet. Remember, even that water that was blue, when they needed water, they used their own. They didn't use that. Is it poisonous? I don't know. And now Ransom is running for his life, and he's completely on his own. So that's our cliffhanger. Anything else? Okay, well, assuming that we feel,
I did find it.
yeah, you found it.
It's on page 37,
Oh.
12 lines down.
Okay. When he saw them, he would eat out of Divine's hands, talking about a sword. His mind, like so many of the generations, was virtually furnished with bogies. Yeah, bogies, but like spooky, scary things.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he'd read H.G. Wells, so you know he got out of this just some sort of ominous fear. Mm-hmm. All right, so if we're going to start with chapter 8, how far do you think we ought to go next time?
Well, let's see. 8, 9, and 10 concludes on page 65, starting at page 49.
Yep.
So it's about 26 pages, I guess.
You want to go to 12?
Yeah, here.
You don't.
Whatever everybody else wants to do.
All right, we have one suggestion of going all 212 or through 12. Okay, so we have one suggestion of reading all the way through chapter 12. But we can read less, we can read more. You guys tell me what you're up for. That would be from 48
to
72. If we read chapter 12, that ends on 77. If we read to the end of 11, that would be to 72. I don't know. You guys tell me. You want to do through 11? Okay. What do you guys think? Through 11, that would be from 48 to 72.
Mm-hmm.
Are we okay with that?
Yep.
All right. So that's what we'll do from 8 through 11 for next time, and we're going to have plenty to talk about. All right. We good?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. See you next time.
Yeah.